Welcome to the next step of your pre-training. We will now move into a slightly more practical approach to discuss the next couple of topics. In order to make this as intuitive as possible, we will now talk out of a scenario into the airport you will train in, Billund. We will discuss arrivals and departures from aspects of both procedural and vectored scenarios, including climbs and descents. This structure I will explain to you 3 times in 3 videos, once for procedures, once for phraseology, and once for sequencing. So buckle up, this is the first one. This is S3, procedures and clearances. Let's start up our scenario with an arrival into Billund from the north. This is SunScan 123. He's inbound to Billund. He's cleared flight level 130 by Copenhagen Control as per the lie. And you now need to guide him in. This is what you should be aware of alongside the process. The first step is obviously that he contacts you, tells you where he is and where he's heading. So what do you say? Many stumbles in their first words and are not quite sure what to say. Don't worry, there are actually quite clear rules on that. AMC2 to TR155 states, prior to or upon commencement of vectoring for approach, the air traffic controller should advise the pilot of the type of approach as well as the runway to be used. This is the first and foremost instruction to give and what to include. 2 things. Type of approach, runway and use. Second thing is information. AMC10 to ATS TR210 is regarding information to aircraft. So remember, this is the law text broken down into what you need to provide, and it is a long text. What is important? As early as practical after an aircraft has established communication, the following elements should be transmitted to the aircraft. Type of approach and the runway in use. Yep, covered that. Meteorological information such as lots of stuff. That will take a lot of time to provide every single pilot with, which is why we have the ATIS. This encapsulates all the weather information to give, which is covered by saying the ATIS letter. If the pilot gives us the ATIS letter, then we can confirm its correctness, or if it's not correct, confirm the latest one. That covers that whole point. Points 3 and 4 are concerning changes in service condition of an operational statuses. If you learn these 2, you would be at quite a high level. SunScan 123, Billund approach identified, expect ILS Zulu approach, runway 27, information alpha is correct. That's it, that's done. Now, you need to actually get him there. For that, we introduce now Scandinavian 456 and split it up, depending if you want to vector him through a series of headings known as radar vectors, or clear him via what is known as a pilot-interpreted waypoint, meaning the 5-digit RNAV waypoint to follow the procedural into the ILS, in accordance with what we already learned about the MSA, approach structure, transition, etc. Which one you choose depends a lot on your sequencing requirement, which is for the next lesson. Next thing is speed control. Here there are a series of limitations you must adhere to. As an aircraft descends below flight level 100, they will reduce the speed to 250 knots. You can further reduce them if you need, but you need to take care of how much you reduce. Below flight level 150, you should avoid speed restrictions of less than 220 knots for turbojet airplanes, as per ICAO Doc 4444.4635. This is because aircraft needs to be kept in a clean speed state as long as possible, the state where no use of high lift devices such as flaps are required. You can also, as per point 4632, just assign minimum clean speed. No matter what their routing is, they must also be descended. The technique of how far and in how many steps to descend in is for the sequencing lesson, so let's instead look at the unwaivable limits. Rule number 1. You cannot descend to or through an already occupied level, which would cause a loss of separation. Each level is, as you remember, surrounded by a 300 feet buffer. Here, for example, level 130 is from level 127 to level 133. So in order for Scandinavian 456 to descend, SunScan 123 must first vacate his level, meaning more than 300 feet away, and positively confirmed in the descent, meaning a downward arrow. This should be pretty easy to understand at this point. Don't forget it. Rule number 2. You may not descend into uncontrolled airspace. Controlled flights must remain inside controlled airspace at all times, meaning you must know just a little bit about the confines of your airspace. Uncontrolled airspace. Class Charlie goes up to 3,500 feet, meaning above 3,500 feet you are safe no matter what. It's this ring from south to north which is an issue, because here the TMA only starts at flight level 45. This means above flight level 45 it's still the TMA and protected Class Charlie, but below this TMA is just regular Class Echo within a CTA, which is also fine, but below this is Class Golf and uncontrolled. This is actually not that much space, so it should be taken into account and make sure that they don't go into uncontrolled airspace. Complex stuff, I know. Rule number 3. You may not descend airplanes below the MSA. Again, it is important to know how high your MSA is at your airport. 23, 2,000 feet are your altitudes in this case, but this we've already covered to a certain extent in the MSA chapter, so this really should not be news for you. Those are the 3 most basic rules. Don't descend into other people's path, don't descend into uncontrolled airspace, don't descend below MSA. But descended, they must be eventually, because at some point you will reach the position of where they need to be terminated from your guidance to begin executing the approach onto the runway. Here we start examining the 2 different flights because they have their differences. Let's start with the vectored one. The vectored one must come at an angle that makes their approach possible without deviating from their path. That means an intercept heading which must be within certain limitations. For an ILS, this means per the ATS AMC2 for Tier 155 that aircraft vectored for the final approach should be giving a heading or a series of heading calculated to close in with the final approach track. The final vector should enable the aircraft to be established on the final approach track prior to intercepting the specific or nominal glide path of the approach procedure from below, and also should provide an intercept angle with the final approach track of 45 degrees or less. So that's a limit, 45 degrees. The minimum is 20. The strong recommendations to always follow is 30 degrees. That will compensate you for exact runway track and modest wind correction. Procedural approaches, however, is a little bit different. From the initial approach fix, you must clear them via a track that, when connected to the first leg of the procedure, generates a no larger than 110 degree angle. The source for this can be found in Doc 8168, the pilot version of Doc 4444, simply because this is part of approach procedure design requirements. Altitude-wise, there are actually differences as well. For the procedural, it's generally simpler. All procedures will have a descent profile aircraft will follow when they are cleared for their approach. You must clear the aircraft down to the first altitude restriction on the procedure, or the MSA, whichever is higher. For Billund, for example, here at OFNEV, the minimum altitude on the first sector is 3,000 feet, meaning ODNEV must be 3,000 feet or above. MSA is 2,300, so 3,000 is indeed the one to go to. Then LOXA, still at 3,000 feet, and then LRIT at 2,000 feet. With vectors to final, it's a bit more vague, but can be referenced with the same point from AMC2 to Tier 155. Now if you look at point D. Aircraft vectored for final approach should be giving a heading or series of heading calculated to close with the final approach track. The final vector should enable the aircraft to be established on the final approach track prior to intercepting the specified or nominal glide path of the approach procedure from below. So you have to clear the pilot to an altitude low enough to enable the pilot to intercept the glide slope from below. This enable is important because it means that you are not responsible for him being below the glide slope when he intercepts the ILS. That is his responsibility as he's the one flying the airplane, but you need to enable him by giving him the opportunity to do so by clearing him to an appropriate altitude and an appropriate time. Now, what is an appropriate altitude? All airports in Denmark has a standard glide slope of 3.0 degrees. Put into terms, this means that the pilot descends 300 feet per nautical miles. Let's look at some typical intercept altitudes. This means at 10 nautical miles, pilot will be at 3,000 feet, at 6.5 miles he's at 2,000, and at 5 miles he's at 1,500. At the runway, hopefully, he's at 0. This means that you must make sure that whichever altitude you descend the pilot to, he must intercept the ILS at a distance before that altitude coincides with the glide path. In general, for 3,000 feet, that's approximately 10 to 12 mile final. For 2,000 feet, a 7 to 9 miles final is appropriate as well. Remember, the altitude must always still be above the MSA and uncontrolled airspace, so while intercept from 2,000 feet may be fine from the south, where the MSA is 2,000, from the north, where the MSA is 2,300, it may not be appropriate unless you know where the obstacles are. Now they're established on the procedure and on their path. Now, speed restrictions. If you gave them a speed restrictions, like here, where you gave SunScan 180 knots and Scandinavian 456 210 knots, you'll need to cancel them at some point, otherwise they can reduce their speed for landing. You see, unlike altitude and path, which are automatically invalidated once a pilot is cleared for approach, a speed restriction actually stays in effect even after the approach clearance. Acceptable means of compliance for TR 210 very clearly states, speed control instructions should remain in effect unless explicitly cancelled or amended by the air traffic controller. You give a speed restrictions of, for example, 180 knots or less, then you're fine, because the less implies that he may reduce the speed as he likes. But with 180 knots or greater, or just 180 knots exactly, you will need to be more proactive in cancelling that restrictions with saying free speed at some point, or modified, with no more than 20 knots at a time, by the way. That's also a legal limit from Doc 4444. So the question is, when? When do you have to do it? There are actually two different limits to consider, both in regards to the 180 and 160 knots restriction you see here. All the way back from ICAO Doc 4444, it states that a 180 knot should generally be cancelled no later than 6 miles from the runway. So there's your first restrictions. You can modify that though through another point from TR 210 stating that any speed restriction must be cancelled no later than 4 miles from the runway, meaning 180 until 6 and 160 until 4. These are good, normal and legal restrictions that you must abide to. Now, both your airplanes and landing and your job as approach controller is now done. Now, there is a departure phase. An airplane coming for departure, clear to flight level 60 as per the SID chart, calling you up. First, you need to address this paragraph from ATS instruction 10.531. Let's translate that into English. The accuracy of Mode Charlie altitude information must be checked at least once by every control station which are equipped to do so, either at first contact or at first opportunity. The check must be done by comparing the Mode Charlie altitude information with the advised passing altitude by the pilot. So what does that mean for you as approach controller practically? It means that aircraft calling up must report their passing altitude. You must now compare that report to your radar scope to ensure it is within approximately 300 feet. If so, all is good and you may continue your instructions and climb him further. What if the pilot does not report his altitude, but just states, for example, climbing flight level 60? Well, then we have to do it the reversed way. Check your scope and report the altitude you are seeing to the pilot. Then the pilot can check it to ensure the transponder and altimeter information are correct. Now, this may seem a bit odd and leaves it wide open to interpretation concerning the control station, but this is our interpretation of VATSIM we'll talk about now, and we'll do it by taking a flight from Billund to Aalborg. You, as a Billund approach and Copenhagen control alike, are both using COPANS, which is part of the Top Sky system. Because you both use the same system, Copenhagen control does not need to verify the passing altitude again, because it's not a new control station. However, Billund Tower is not a COPANS environment, it is a non-radar environment. Therefore, this check must be done by you at first contact with an airplane checking in on Billund approach. And let's take that a step further. If you sit on Aalborg approach, which is also an S3 position, you are also not using COPANS, you are using Radis, a similar environment used by all airports in Denmark except Billund, Copenhagen and Roskilde. So for approach in Aalborg, the altitude must be verified again. Good then. Once that is done, you need to clear him higher over his route to flight level 120, which is the extent of your airspace, and modify his routing if appropriate. His speed restriction, which is normally 250 below level 100, may be cancelled if all of his climbs are in Class Charlie airspace. Remember, places like Aalborg and Aarhus where TMA is Delta until 3500 and then Echo above, you are not allowed to cancel that speed restriction. In Billund, luckily your TMA goes all the way up to flight level 105. That's the first part completed. You might be tired already, but we will continue now with the next two parts where we'll do the same scenario again, but in this time then talking about correct phraseology and then talking about sequencing the planes. We've covered the requirements for what you need to do procedural-wise with arrivals and departures. You may now continue. Thanks for watching.